Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ and would like to welcome you to today's Connect with FSLogix. We're going to be talking about apps in Office 365 container for Citrix. Just quickly go over our format today. We'll have our presentation and Q&A discussion, and we'd like you to type all of your questions into the question area in the GoToWebinar control panel, which is where our moderator will keep an eye on those. Our presentation is also being recorded and will be available on mycugc.org shortly after the webinar later this afternoon. Our moderator today is Jo Harder. She is a CTP and also a leader of CUGC Tampa. Jo is also a pretty regular blogger for us on CTP Insights, and we hope you'll go over to mycugc.org and read some of her articles. Our presenter today is Dave Young. Dave is the lead solutions architect and product champion at FSLogix. And with that, I will turn that over to Dave so he can tell you a little bit more about himself and get us started. Dave, I'm sending you the screen right now.
Awesome. Thank you much. So good afternoon, good morning to all. Good evening if you're joining us in the evening. My name's Dave Young. I'm going to give you guys a little of my background so you understand where I'm coming from. I've been in the end-user computing space for a long time now. My career has been all over the place. I started out in the Navy, couldn't type very well, ended up in IT, strangely enough, because I knew how to fix computers. Got out of the Navy, moved on to corporate America, worked through a lot of different things, was a leader in virtualization in early 2000. Ended up at one of the largest banks in the world and owned not only end-user compute, but the Citrix team and virtualization. And that's where I kind of dabbed my toe into VDI. We were given a lot of projects to do, and we just couldn't deploy PCs fast enough, and we couldn't put 2 or 3 PCs on everybody's desk. It just wasn't financially feasible. So we started doing desktop brokering. And this was at the time where our broker was this fancy thing called DNS. And we brokered users via DNS to their virtual machines so that we could solve problems. We owned a very large Citrix environment in that arena and basically managed all those different components. Moved on in my career to VMware, where I was a founding member of the VDI team at VMware. We call that the Council of Seven. And we were very instrumental not only from a technology and sales perspective, but also technology and product drive perspective. And left VMware, and Kevin Goodman, good friend of mine, called me up one day, and the famous words are, "What are you doing?" Well, I'd been doing some things on my own, and he asked me to come join him so that we could finish fixing things that we hadn't been able to do in the VDI realm while we were at VMware. So that's a little of my background. We're going to talk a little bit about FSLogix. And what do we do? So FSLogix was founded by Kevin Goodman and our CTO, Randy Cook, sorry. And Randy, his background goes back to the Symantec days. So he's been doing virtualization for end-user compute for a while. Randy's a very smart guy, loves to solve problems. And I liaison with Randy in regards to some of the things that we're seeing as far as trends out in the industry. A little bit about our customers. We've got all sorts of different, big names up there. We were the winners of Best of Citrix Synergy 2015, and we are Citrix, Microsoft, and VMware partners. Some of the industry out there, and Joe, I got to get a quote up there from you, but a lot of the guys out there and gals out there have great things to say about us. We're solving problems that are very, very important to the end-user compute arena. One of the things that I often hear is virtualization, desktop virtualization specifically, is a very, very small portion of the overall end-user compute. And one of the things that we are striving to do at FSLogix is to make that transition easier for the corporation and the end user. And you'll see some of our products make life better both for IT and the end user as we start to deploy these products. Love this one. This was one of our customers that made a quote at one of the CUGCs, and he was very happy with Office 365 containers. If you guys want to check that out, you can see more things from him. We also have high recommendations from Citrix and Microsoft as the solution that solves this problem with Office 365 and specifically OSTs. One of the things that we're seeing out there is a lot of problems around how do we bring end user experience to a hosted arena. And a lot of these problems are driven by cost, they're driven by performance metrics, and they're driven by expectations from the end user. So we've got some pretty good things that came out of that Microsoft Ignite meeting. So let's talk about one of the things that is really causing us angst within IT, especially when it comes to VDI, and that's folder redirection. Folder redirection came into us as a way to make all these components that were on the user's desktop remote so that IT could manage them and try to re-image machines, yet appear to be local. And the problem with folder redirection is it's a fetch and retrieve technology, meaning when I log in, I have to go and grab several components to build out my desktop. And as I grab those components, that takes time. And basically we end up into a traffic copying scenario where the server that is giving this data to the end user can only handle so many requests, and we end up into a bottleneck. We sometimes refer to these as login storms. It's great to be the person that comes into work at 6:55. Not so good to be the person that comes into work when everybody else does at 8 a.m. because now I'm competing along with thousands of other users to get those resources. And this is one that causes IT a lot of problems because it's not predictable. As we start to look at this, if I have 600 users log in, everything's fine, but I forget that there's going to be a double shift on Mondays and it's 1,200 users, all of a sudden these file servers become overwhelmed. And that's what's causing us a lot of problem. It's that fetch and retrieve technology. And end users are not always the best stewards of fetch and retrieve. They like to keep things on their desktop, right? Well, if I put something on my desktop, I have to then present that to my desktop as I go through the login process. Now, there are some technologies out there that do some cool things like stubbing, right? And the important thing to remember when you do stubbing is, hey, if I put we'll just use an ISO as an example, a DVD, put a DVD on my desktop that's 4 gigs worth of data. And if I stub that, that's great, but I still have to pull the entire 4 gigs of that data across the wire when I decide to access it. And this is the kind of stuff that causes us performance problems. I love we get our logins to X number of seconds advertisement, and in reality is those seconds have to be paid for somewhere. And you'll see that how we change things is very fundamental to not doing fetch and retrieve anymore. And by not doing fetch and retrieve anymore and doing something fundamentally different, that gives us an advantage when it comes to file reads, that I don't have to go fetch the entire file. So we talk about that DVD. I was just doing this with a customer a few weeks ago. He had put us into a test environment. It takes us about 15 minutes to set a customer up for profile redirection or profile folder containers. And so we got him all set up, and the first thing he did was he copied 2 DVDs, Batman movies, to the desktop. And he says, when I log out, if it takes more than 15 seconds to log in, you have not accomplished what you said you would accomplish. So he logged out, logged back in, and he was right at about 9 seconds. And that was Dave counting, not stopwatch or anything, but right at 9 seconds. And he was astonished. And then he went and he hit play, and he started playing that movie. Now, the cool thing, I didn't realize this when he was getting ready to do it, but this was really cool. The really cool part of this was when the DVD came up and he was getting ready to hit play, he had to select a language. And this particular DVD had 2 languages on it, American, English, and French. And so he chose the English version, and I just had this realization that, wow, we were able to reduce by at least half the amount of traffic that click needed to go retrieve. Because now, instead of going and pulling back both versions of the movie that are incorporated within that DVD, what he was able to do is just read the blocks of the movie piece that he wanted to watch, the English version. And by watching it, from that perspective, those were the only blocks that were being read while he was watching the movie. So it really changes what we're doing. So instead of a full 4 gig pull, we were down to hundreds of K as it read through the blocks that it needed to watch that movie. And that's the beauty of folder interception or VHDs that we get to take advantage of. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit more about technology. Joe, are there any questions out there before I get deep into the different product sets?
Well, I think before we dig into everything, what I want to talk through is, one of the rules of XenApp and XenDesktop for any deployment is what you set up where and how that impacts the user experience. So I know we're going to get into a discussion of Office 365, which breaks the whole concept of keeping your data next to your Citrix environment. But as we get into the discussion of the folder redirection, as we get into the containers and so forth, if we can, whatever you can throw in terms of examples, let's do that. We have a couple of questions coming in so far, but I'm going to hold off because I think that some of these things will be covered in your materials going forward. So let's keep it going.
Awesome. All right. So let's talk a little bit about plan design. So Joe brought up Office 365. Office 365 right now in my mind is one of the most disruptive technologies that we have seen in a long, long time. It's worse than virtualization was. I remember when people were first selling virtualization, it tore IT shops apart, right? It was very disruptive. What's going on with Office 365 is they're selling at an executive decision-making level. They're not talking about the technology. The sales pitch goes a little bit like this. Hey, Mr. CIO or CFO, how would you like to be able to deprecate all your file servers, all your Exchange servers, reallocate the personnel that are managing those, and pay me a monthly fee, and I'll host it. And guess what? You can have a terabyte of storage for OneDrive and 500 gig or 50 gigs of storage for your OST or for your mail file. And that sounds very, very compelling at a financial level. The part that's not being told, and Joe just kind of hit on this a little bit, is the end user is going to be ultimately very upset because they're going to be forced back to doing mail online, which means we have to drag every byte, every piece of data across the wire. And that starts to become very laggy to the end user and starts to impact their productivity. So as we start to look at that, as soon as you find out you have an Office 365 migration scheduled, that they're going down this path, there's a lot of things that you want to think about. Number one, I/O, okay? If you go to full online mode, your I/O bottleneck is going to be your WAN, okay? If you decide to offset that I/O bottleneck by doing OSTs or cached mode, you need to think about I/O and where you're going to store that stuff. Typically, we don't want to store it on the physical device that's presenting the VDI session or the XenApp session. We want to store it on shared storage. Well, that runs into a pretty significant problem because Microsoft, albeit they say that an OST stored on a network share is supported, there's this little caveat, note, quote, exception to the rule that they point out that you don't normally see, and that is for a light user. And when they define a light user, which I have not gotten them to define, they just say a light user. So the question becomes, is a light user Dave Young? I get about 50 to 150 emails a day, and they usually have like large attachments in them. So I'm not a heavy mail user in my mind. 50 to 150 emails a day, that's nothing. But if you look at our CEO, he gets somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 emails a day. But they're very, very small. They're usually like, hey, do you have a job for me? Or, hey, I'd like to buy your product, right? So when we look at the difference in those two types of users, what is a light user? And I ultimately have come down to the decision on what a light user is whatever doesn't get yelled at, right? So if you get, one email a day, we can support that. But as you start to scale this out, it starts to cause I/O bottlenecks on that file share. And it has to do with the way that the OST behaves. That OST is very much a database. And if we all remember back to our SQL days, if you ever had to manage a SQL farm, the most costly operation was extending the database, letting it grow in size. We always wanted to pre-allocate those things so that didn't happen during production hours because that's a very costly operation. Well, now you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of little databases sitting on your network share, extending every time a piece of email comes in. Or maybe it's every other piece of email, but it's very unpredictable. And heaven forbid, it's a company-wide broadcast of, company results, and everybody gets it at the same time. Now, all of a sudden, I have hundreds of thousands of mail files all trying to do an extent on a live file share, and that becomes very, very painful. The next thing is, let's talk about the OST size. Little gotcha fact out there. The maximum size for an OST with all the right product combinations, et cetera, is 50 gig. Okay. When I first got started in IT, I remember limiting our end users to 50 meg of email. So 50 gig is just a tremendous amount of data, and that's per mailbox. So if you have multiple mailboxes, shared mailboxes, this starts to become a very large amount of data. And if we're looking at doing caching, that's a bit of data that we have to account for. Now, we talked about, Microsoft saying they could deprecate the file shares and the Exchange servers and all that good stuff. Don't go throw those out with the garbage, right? You want to keep those things because you're going to need somewhere to put this stuff. So I generally preach, put it as close to the raw storage as you can. We don't need a whole lot of intelligence or management around that, but you're definitely going to need spindles, you're going to need I/O, and you're going to need space. And those are the things that are really going to be things that you need. Let's talk about the CPU impact. So one of the reasons today we don't like cached exchange or OSTs is because every time the user logs in, we either have to persist that data or rebuild it. If we persist that data, we've got issues there. If we rebuild it, that becomes a network and CPU impact on that environment. So I did a study about a year and a half ago of what was the impact on a 4 gig mailbox, and ultimately going across a 10 meg link, a 4 gig email or a 4 gig mailbox took about 15 minutes to prep, and it ate up 33% of the CPU. So when you think about that, if I'm doing this over and over and over again, I'm just wasting CPU cycles. And then, the last thing is our silos and our complexity. How do we start to remove some of those silos and complexity? And all these things impact how we're going to deploy this infrastructure. And the last thing that we just need to think about and touch light on too is single sign-on. With Office 365, keep in the back of your mind that there's an entitlement process, and that entitlement process is not always tied to your current authentication schema. So you may have to deal with a broken single sign-on. It's not as bad if you can cache those credentials, which we have the capabilities of doing, but it is bad if you're rebuilding that user's environment every time they log in. They're not going to want to re-authenticate to the Microsoft Office 365 portal every time they log in. So a little bit about how we can help. We have several different products, but they basically break down into 3 categories. The first one is profile containers, okay? And that gives us the capability to intercept the user's profile, throw it all into a container, store it out on the VHD on a shared network location, okay? And that gives us the capability, instead of fetching and retrieving all this stuff, all we're going to do is intercept the folder that exists at CUsers%username. We're going to map that folder to the VHD so that the subsequent contents of that folder are presented in line as a VHD. Now, the benefit of that is instead of fetching files on the fly and building out a profile, now all we're doing is intercepting that folder so that we can present that data. I don't think anybody would argue with me that local reads and writes are much, much faster than network reads and writes. I think that's something we all understand as fundamental concepts. Now when I throw at you that a local read and write via VHD is faster than a network read and write, that starts to get people thinking. And the reason it's faster is instead of doing an entire file load, we're actually only reading blocks. A good example of this is I was given a presentation a couple months ago, and I was logged into one of my demo environments because it had a demo that went with it, and downloaded the presentation, and you guys will laugh at me. The presentation is 108 megs in size. There's a couple of videos in it and things like that. And I downloaded it, and I got a pop-up warning, and it said running low on disk space. And I was like, that's odd. And I'll clean this machine up later. It's just a demo machine. So I went and made some edits to the presentation. I hit save, and I couldn't save it. I was out of disk space. So as I started looking a little deeper, I was like, reality hit me. As I started looking for what was eating up all my disk space, I found out that this 108 meg presentation, when I grabbed it from OneDrive, had technically downloaded to my iNet cache. And my iNet cache had this 108 meg file in it. And then when I hit save, and I saved it to the local desktop because that's where I wanted it, it wrote another 108 meg file. So as you start to look at this, that's what's going on in the background. Versus if I had been doing it from a VHD, I would have read the slides that I was looking at, presented those in visual context, modified them, and then when I hit save, we would have wrote the blocks to the file system on the actual pieces that changed. So that's a little why the profile container is so much more efficient. The number of writes gets reduced dramatically compared to doing a full save on a file. And then we've got our Office 365 container. This one is one that has been generating a lot of buzz in the industry for us, and that's basically being able to intercept app data local, Microsoft Office / Outlook folder. And by intercepting that, the contents of that Outlook folder are now encapsulated within a VHD. So now when the user logs in, our filter driver basically comes up and looks at it and says, okay, I've got Dave Young here. I need to map Dave Young to a VHD at the App Data Local Microsoft Outlook folder. And when it does that, it then gives me the contents of that folder, which allows me to present the rest of my mail. Works very, very well. There's a couple other things that we do underneath the covers. There's some registry stuff that we bring in that's specific to that Outlook session. But ultimately, that's what we're doing. And then the last piece of what we're doing is our apps and Java piece. Our app stuff is pretty cool. I spent several years of my life as a software packaging architect. I was SoftGrid or Softricity certified and Thinstall certified. And I went out and worked with companies to help them put their application in the bubble. And generally, it was a very time-consuming practice, and we never got it 100% because there's all these interfaces and all that good stuff that made it very, very difficult. What we do is totally different, and it allows us to basically install the app natively and then mask it from users that don't need it. Our Java piece, which is really important. I don't know a company that doesn't have a Java problem. The Java piece allows us to map a user, more so a machine environment, to a specific version of Java. So I come in, I launch Internet Explorer, and I go to nasa.gov. Well, nasa.gov is using Java version 1.5. Our company standard is whatever the latest and greatest is, 1.8 or 1.9, whatever it is. Well, that becomes a problem. The end user can't use the appropriate version of Java they want. This gives us the capability to be very, very specific. When a user comes in and they go to this specific URL down to the letter, right, we'll allow them a certain version of Java. Everything else goes to a different version. Or when they launch this application, it launches with this specific version of Java. And this gives us the ability within IT to very simply allow those one-off accesses to places that we trust without compromising our security. We don't want the user to be able to use any version of Java at gostealmycompanycredentials.com, right? We want them only to be able to use that weak version of Java where we know it is a trusted and approved site. So that's a little of the stuff that allows us to do this. On the apps piece, one more piece to push out there and keep in the back of our mind, it allows us to reduce that complexity because now I can have things like 3 versions of Office. I can have Office 2010, 2013, and 2016 all running on the same physical or logical piece of equipment. All I have to do is hide 2 of the 3 from the user. And by hiding 2 of the 3 from the user, now if a user comes in, they need Office 2010, they don't see 2013 or 2016. A different user comes in and they need to see Office 2013, they're not going to see 2010 or 2016. And it gives us that flexibility to not have to have silos just based off of Office.
So Dave, can we stop for just a minute here and talk through what you've just explained? Because I want to make sure that everybody completely understands this. I want to preface this by saying I've been a huge FSLogix fan for quite a while now, because I think your product does something very unique in the market, and especially now with the Office 365 piece, which I know we're going to spend a lot more time talking about. In terms of the profile piece, a couple of questions have come up so far with regard to PVD as well as the, let me just find that in here, transitioning from Citrix UPM. Can you talk about that with regard to the profile, or are you going to get that more into that in just a few minutes?
Well, let's hit the UPM piece of it first. UPM served a great role, and it still has some validity in what we're doing. We're not necessarily a rip and replace in our opinion of UPM, but what we do find is because we don't have to move files around anymore, UPM is used more for I need to enforce a policy. Now, one of the things that UPM does very well is when a user logs off, it cleans up after itself. And we do run into some tension, so there's some configuration changes that you have to implement because we don't want UPM deleting the folder C user's %username when the user logs off. We want to allow us to disconnect that folder. And I think everybody agrees disconnecting a folder is probably a lot faster than deleting the contents of a folder. So there are some minor tweaks that we have to do to make the two coexist, but we can definitely make them coexist. On the other part of that question was the PVD stuff. We can work with PVDs. We have one of the benefits that we have is we can transition across multiple different segments. And when I say segments, I'm referring to boundaries of disk, host, et cetera, because we are technically just a CIFS share access away. So as we start to build this, I can have a couple file servers serving up VHD space and hundreds or thousands of Citrix heads coming to those for data. So it kind of changes some of our boundaries. There are, once again, some tweaks that we need to do to make the two coexist, but they can coexist if need be. And the transition from UPM, if you so desire, is pretty simple. One of the great things that UPM did is they basically just used the roaming profile settings. So if you literally copy the contents of that stuff back to the machine, your user's profile is able to be transitioned very simply. It's not like you have to go out and extract a whole bunch of stuff from a database. I have worked on some of those where the user's environment is built from a database, and as we start to look at that, there are ways that you basically come up, build that environment, capture your settings, shut things off, close out, and then shut some more things off so that you can make that transition. So there's a lot of things we can do for that transition piece. Any other questions on that, Joe?
Well, I think I really want to give plenty of time to focus on Office 365, so let me let you keep going on that, and we'll hold off on the 365 questions because that to me is just so huge. I totally agree with what you're saying about the executives. The IT executives are sold on the concept of Office 365. They purchase it and then say to IT, make it so, and there's a lot of things that are not considered. So
you know, it's funny you point that out, Joe, because a few weeks ago I was out in Phoenix and I told my story of how Microsoft is selling this. And this guy, he didn't call me a liar, but he says, no. The CFO would come talk to us before they did that. And I said, okay. I said, why don't you go talk to your CFO and find out if he's been having talks with Microsoft. About a week later, he sent me an email, and he was not very kind in the words he used about Microsoft because they had been talking to his CFO for almost a month and had never once engaged IT. And what happens in that regards is CFO signs off on it. It's a great business story. He thinks he's doing a great thing. And he probably is, or she probably is. But then when IT gets a hold of it, it's broke. Why can't you fix it? And I was told by Microsoft this would work, so it becomes a huge burden on IT. So we want to make sure that you guys are armed to have that conversation so that you can make sure you don't end up in what I call resume generating event. So let's talk a little bit about profile containers. The magic of this, when I was at VMware and when I was selling a lot, the one thing I preached, and it got a lot of attention from the IT people, non-persistent desktop is utopia. And I would say that, and I'd yell it from the pulpit, and everybody would get excited. All the IT people were like, hoorah, hoorah, yes, this is awesome, instant updates, no more, worrying about the end user, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the side effect to that was, and I always hoped that there wasn't an end user sitting in the crowd, because a non-persistent desktop to an end user is not the greatest thing in the world. It's a painful thing in the world. So with profile containers, what we're able to do is get the best of both worlds. I can get a persistent user environment with a non-persistent desktop. So that means there's, I love this phrase, win-win, right? IT wins and the end user wins. And that gives us the ability to be able to maintain that flexibility but not impact the user. And that also gives us the ability to eliminate folder redirection, right? Which by eliminating folder redirection is going to speed up logins. And it's going to make that end user's environment much, much better. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to hit a little on the Office 365 piece of it and how it all comes together. So from the Office 365 piece, we introduced this piece of technology. There's been some great enhancements that have fallen or flowed into other pieces of our product set. But ultimately, the Office 365 piece is built on our profile container technology. Okay, so that's a very mature technology that we've been running with for about 3 years, and it gives us the ability to segment and isolate the user's Outlook data, the OST, into its own VHD. And this is really, really important, especially if you're in an environment. Let's just say, you're knee-deep into UPM, and there's no way you're going to be able to back out of UPM, but you got this problem. Right? They just brought in Office 365. In 15 minutes or less, we can set up your Office 365 settings so that you can have an Office 365 container, and that gives us the capability to just capture that one particular folder that is important for Outlook. All right? And that will coexist with most any of the end user management type tools that are managing profiles. So by doing that, we're able to have these things coexist. And this was built and priced and designed to be a very tactical fix. CFO came in and said, do this, you guys are having a hard time, you're about to have that resume generating event because you're not going to succeed. And for a very, very low cost, generally about 10% of what you're paying for your Office 365 subscription, you're able to go in, put this point fix in place, and continue moving on so that you're able to return to the business the desire that they wanted. Okay. Some of the things that we're bringing out and are in the process of finishing up is support in OneDrive. We're in our final beta for support in OneDrive, which means you'll be able to take that OneDrive data and cache it also. And that's very important because as we start to look at the path of what happens, first you have to give them an OST. Well, that's great. But then they want to save the email, the data in the email, the presentation to OneDrive, and OneDrive's across the wire. So bringing those two together so that we can have local cache, which is speedy performance, of OneDrive and the OST is very, very important. We see the OneDrive and OST data as what we call disposable or easily recreatable data. So it doesn't need to be protected. You might want to do backups just because of the quantity of data and you don't want to have to recreate all that stuff. But ultimately, the Exchange servers and OneDrive are the authoritative source for that data. So that gives us the capability to not have to put a lot of bells and whistles around our storage unit for storing of that data. And ultimately, it's very low I/O data because we're randomly reading small blocks of data versus reading large files. So it starts to change what we're able to do in the realm of providing a user experience that is as the user wants it, speedy, near local, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I want to cover is we're working on and wrapping up, and this is in beta also, the ability to store the credentials for that Office 365 experience. So your user will not have to come in and re-authenticate or re-entitle every time they come onto a new machine. So that gives us the capability of having all this stuff containerized so that you can keep your Citrix servers or your VDI machines as bare vanilla as possible, getting to that non-persistent state, yet allowing the user to have a very persistent experience. Any other questions around the OST piece of that before I talk about image management?
Yeah, I do want to just step back for a moment and maybe explain a little bit more of the scenario. So as we talked about earlier, in a Citrix environment, you always want your data as close as possible to your XenApp or XenDesktop environment. Office 365 creates a chasm in between the two, and you're bridging that gap. I think that is totally awesome.
You know, when I first started down this path, I thought it was totally awesome too. Now that I've been doing it for as long as I have, it's kind of like, why didn't somebody else think of this? And you're right, we are bridging that gap. And what we're able to do is allow that flexibility that the CFO is tied into decommissioning the Exchange, decommissioning the file shares that have all this data on it, to allow them to have that, and then putting in what I consider, grunt work file servers to provide that cache. So we're able to keep that data that the user is using as close to them as possible so that that experience is very, very snappy. I was talking to our VP of Sales, Andy Tynes, and he was having a hard time getting his head around how important this was. And I said, well, you know what, we're going to set you up on a VDI session, and you're going to go online mode, and you're going to start doing work, and you're going to count every time you have to pause and wait for the email to finish pulling in. And it wasn't but about 3 hours, and he called me, and he's like, I got it, I get it. Being able to run fast is very, very important. And so to put this all in very, very simple layman's terms is we are the cache for old storage. Right? If you go out and you've got old 5400 RPM disk in your storage and you put some fancy cache in between there, it will appear as if you have 100,000 IOPS, but in reality, everything's still written to old 5400 RPM disk. So, we are that cache to the file, the storage system. Another analogy I love to give is you got two cars, identical engines in them. Well, we're the turbocharger in the other engine. Right, we're able to make that same engine perform much faster because we kind of change the game on what's happening. And that allows us to have a very nice end user experience. We've gotten kudos that when I read them, I'm kind of like, I don't believe the story that's being told to me until I really, take a step back and look at it. One of our customers, kind of a funny story, he had went down the folder redirection path for OSTs, and was about to have a resume generating event, stumbled across us, implemented us, and out of that implementation, one of his customers was complaining, and he worked on it, got him switched over, and after he got him switched over, they were so happy they sent him a case of rum. Now, I don't advocate, bribing your IT people with cases of rum, but if an end user is so happy with a new experience that they're willing out of their own pocket to send you a gift, you've done something right for the end user. And we all have to remember it's the end user that keeps us employed, right? Making that end user's experience is a very, very important thing because if they don't stay happy, they're going to go to other alternatives, and we want to make sure that we're not forcing them to other alternatives. So,
excellent point.
Anything else on that?
Yeah, actually there are a few questions about, one is where are the VHDs stored?
That is a great question, and it's one that I don't always put enough highlight to. You store them on a simple file share. I am an advocate of putting them as close to the direct storage as you can. You don't have to carve out a special Windows machine. You could put these right on a CIF share coming from your NetApp, your Nutanix, whatever storage you have, you can carve this out, put this directly on there. Okay, we use simple CIFS technology. If you can talk to the disk via network access, we can write the VHD there. And it doesn't have to be necessarily fast. Now, every environment's going to be different, okay? But the fact is, I have watched storage systems that are on the kilter of dying because they're just overloaded, by putting in FSLogix immediately a 30% reduction on usage. So, a 30% reduction on usage just by changing a technology is huge. Now, a lot of the times I tell people this, and they come back, and I love it when they do this. Dave, you didn't know what you're talking about. I'm seeing 72% reduction in I/O. Well, great. You got a great environment. You're seeing a huge reduction. Based on your own environment, you will see things that are, higher or lower, but I'm comfortable saying you should see a 30% reduction in I/O.
Excellent. Okay, another question is, what if your XenApp farm is spread across multiple data centers? Talk to me about how you would sync.
Yep. So what we recommend is using some kind of block level replication. Okay. I have seen DFS work well. I have seen storage-based file or block level replication work well. What you basically want to do is mirror those two, and then with our tool, you can actually preface, or you can use something similar to DFS to say go to the shortest path. We have several customers that go across network links. We got one up in Canada. They got about 52 milliseconds of latency across their 2 network links, and they have a disaster. They route from site A, where the user is accessing, to site B, where their data exists. Now, they are in the process of doing block level replication, because the reality is if site B is down, they probably want everybody going through site A. But for their immediate need, it did meet the desire. Their bigger concern was having, their virtualization infrastructure have a problem, not necessarily their storage. But you do want to keep this as close to the end user as possible. You don't want to try and tell the end user, come across that 56K modem and access a whole bunch of data. It's just not going to work. It becomes a piping problem.
And that's no way to get that case of rum sent to you.
Exactly. It'll be a spoiled case of rum if you do that.
Exactly. Okay, let's do one more question before we keep going, and that relates to integration with PBS. So the question on this is, does the Office 365 container have any impact with PBS target devices? Specifically asking about the write to the intercepted app data folder.
It doesn't.
Okay.
That is something that happens after the machine is up and running, and we basically, we intercept it, and it's after the machine is up and running. I've got hundreds of customers that are running PBS type environments, and it works just fine, not an issue.
Awesome. Okay, let's keep it going, but obviously a lot of the questions are with regard to Office 365. So let's...
Yeah, that's a big buzz one. I'm going to give them a couple other career enhancing points. Let's talk about unified base image management. It's a big fancy word for let's get rid of the silos, right? When I worked at the bank, I had a big wall in my office that had literally hundreds and hundreds of different types of environments that were basically business lines of demarcation. This business had to have these certain apps come together, and it had to be a certain version of MDAX, certain version of Java, la-di-da, la-di-da, and it was very, very complex, and we had these huge arenas of silos, okay? Well, we're saying, hey, you don't need silos. You don't need to have, 3 silos for Office, one for 2010, 2013, and 2065. We're saying install it all, install it natively, and use masking. And if you want to take it back to as simple of a technology as it is we are just hiding a file. And by hiding that file, now we do it at the file system level, and there's a lot of intelligence that has gone into this. Our CTO, Randy Cook, he came from Symantec. He was one of the guys on SVS. Right, so he understands this file system. Actually, the FS and FSLogix stands for file system. So we really understand what's going on at the file system level. So by using this filter driver, what we're able to do is we're able to take the entire contents of, we'll use Office 365 as an example, and hide the entire contents of that and the registry settings from the end user and from the system. So when I go to install a different version of Office, it has no knowledge that there's even anything remotely related to Office. If you go in and you look at Control Panel, it's not there. If you go look at the disk, it's not there. If you go look at the registry, it's not there. So by being able to do that, we're able to make these applications coexist on the same infrastructure, but present to the end user. Now, there are 2 very special caveats I want to make sure I point out. We are not saying you can run Office 2016 and Office 97 at the same time. All right, that is a very special scenario. We have done some cool stuff with folder redirection and registry redirection to make that work. But in a nutshell, we're saying take your bases, right? Get them out there and make them a part of your base image, and then use masking to present that to the user. And your migration of a user from something like 2010 to 2013 is literally dragging and dropping their user account from one group in AD to another group, because we use AD to actually entitle these people. So when you look at that, I could literally take a whole entire department, the finance department, and at 2 o'clock tomorrow, because it's Friday, finance doesn't work a minute after 1, 2 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to drag the entire finance department from Office 2010 to Office 2013 and be done with my migration. So when they logged in on Monday, they would see the next version of Office that was presented to them. And if there was a problem with 1 or 2 users, I don't have to move everybody back. I don't have to worry about catastrophe happening in the environment. I take those 1 or 2 users and I say, you know what, Sally Sue, I'm going to move you back because we need to figure out what's going on with you. So I drag them from one group to the other, ask them to log back in, and when they log back in, they're right back to where they were. So it really reduces a lot of that complexity that we have in our environment. And a lot of times we see it reducing the need for application virtualization. It allows us to go with the near native experience that the application was originally intended to support.
So Dave, this was how I first came to know FSLogix, actually first came to know and love FSLogix, probably about, I don't know, a couple years ago. There is one question related to this, and that's how can I install conflicting apps on the same image if they're 32 and 64-bit Office?
It's the magic of what our CTO has made so easy. Ultimately, though, when you install the 32-bit and you create a masking rule, you're going to hide it, you're going to put the masking rule on, and then you're going to install the 64-bit. And it has no idea, because technically we have uninstalled the Office 32-bit version, so it has no idea that the other version exists. And the only time those versions are presented is when the user logs in and is entitled to see one or the other of those versions.
Excellent. Okay, let's zip through Java control and let's get over, I know you're going to talk about Office 365 a whole lot more.
Yep. So Java, it's 30 seconds or less. If you've got a Java problem, this is the simplest thing in the world. You write a simple rule. When a user comes in, map Java version 1.5 to this URL or application. It is very, very simple. It's automatic. It's almost set it and forget it. A lot of times it is one of those things people forget about because it just allows that remapping to happen. And it controls multiple different versions. You can be as specific as, you know, a long, long URL, or as generic as nasa.gov. Right, and it allows us to be able to have those multiple versions of Java tied down to the specific location that we want them to go to. Very, very simple, doesn't impact security, or does impact security, doesn't worsen security, and it allows us to run with the highest version of Java as default and make exceptions for those trusted sites that need lower versions. Very, very simple. All right, let's talk about a little bit about application optimization, right? Pretty simple fact, app virtualization adds an overhead and a CPU cost, right? It's not huge, it's not, you know, earth-shattering, but it all adds up. And when we look at native versus app virt, native is always going to be faster than app virtualization, and we run as a native. We are very much like the firewall rule. The best firewall rule is deny all, right? And then allow specific things through. So we are denying all to see the application and then allowing the finance group to be able to see whatever application we want them to see. So that gives us a very efficient performance on the subsystem. Folder redirection versus what we're doing. This is huge. You're going to see less I/O, okay, because we no longer have to read entire files. We're going to see less CPU because we're not reading that entire file. We're only reading blocks. And we're going to see an impact on search. And this is really, really important. One of the things that we're going to talk about here shortly is the fact that we haven't had search environments for so long. These all add up to impacting our session density. If I'm able to squeeze 5 more users onto a Citrix server, there's a value there. That means I can reduce the number of Citrix servers I have to maintain or purchase or upgrade, et cetera, et cetera. And that's ultimately comes down to what we call VTax or HP tax or Dell tax, whatever you want to call it. Reducing the amount of those physical devices that are needed in the data center means a savings to IT. And this is ultimately going to impact your profile and login times. Because we're optimizing and it no longer takes 55 seconds to log in and X amount of CPU, it's going to take 10 seconds to log in and a much smaller amount of CPU. This is all good things that are given back to the end user. So these are things that we can help you accomplish. So let's talk a little bit about a study I did recently, and then we're going to really go deep into some Office 365 stuff and some cool announcements. So I did a thing with Uber Agent, with Helge Klein, good friend of mine, and our CEO, Kevin Goodman. And ultimately, Kevin Goodman called me at like 11 o'clock one night, and he said, Dave, we're going to do this thing with Uber Agent, and I want you to be able to prove that we're faster. And I said, okay, and let me figure out how I'm going to do that. So how I did that is I virtualized an environment, built up file share, did roaming profiles, lived as an end user in a machine for a while, and I copied block for block, byte for byte, file for file from one environment to the other so that I could duplicate what was happening. All right? So identical infrastructure, it's an identical desktop, and it's identical user data. And we logged into that machine, and you can see here, here's the comparative. So under a standard roaming profile, which is fetch and retrieve technology, the login was 42.98 seconds. For niceness, we'll call it 42 seconds. And under FSLogix, using folder interception, we're able to do that at 7.78 seconds. We'll call it 8. That is a huge difference just in the end user's life. You know, that equates out to like an extra work week of work that I get to be able to accommodate in my lifespan, you know, every year because I'm not waiting on logins. Now, there are some customers that like that long login because they go get their coffee, you know, their cappuccino or whatever, but ultimately we want to be able to put users back to work. And by reducing that, that reduces the amount of data that we have to deal with. So this summary, very high level, but it's very important. When you have login stories, when you're doing fetch and retrieve, the more users, the more impact that you have, the worse the experience gets. And you can see these spikes. These spikes are when, you know, this would be the first one, 7 o'clock when everybody logs in, or 8 o'clock when everybody logs in, or 9 o'clock when everybody logs in, and the amount of traffic that's being generated and that file system being overloaded, and it can only respond with so much. Now, you'll see that there is a big green line there. In that particular arena, we're on the same file share. I had overloaded the file share infrastructure so much that even we were having a hard time just getting in and getting a handle to open up a file. All right, I had to physically reboot the environment to gain control of it again, but it is pretty significant. If you look at the linear lines, though, you'll see that the green line changes very little over time, which means I get predictable scientific data on what I should be able to expect from my end user's environment, versus the red line kind of hockey sticks. You know, the more I throw at it, the more it goes up. And that becomes a problem, and that's the one that generates a lot of help desk calls for us. And I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that because it is important for you to understand how much of an impact this is going to have.
Okay,
I
Dave.
apologize, folks. I got a little bit of a cough, so I might have to mute myself in a second.
Okay, Dave, we've got 6 minutes left, and I really want to focus on Office 365 because this is great. I love all of this. Can we jump into the Office 365 piece?
Yep. So real quick, I want to throw out that we added a couple new things. High availability for the container, per user, per group configuration settings, which means one less silo that I got to worry about, and support for multiple versions of profiles. So it gives you the ability to just simplify your infrastructure even more. So let's go to the important part that Joe keeps getting me onto. So this is a sneak peek of what we're getting ready to finish beta on. All right. So for the last 25 years, this is how long I've been in IT, we have limited the end user's experience when they're in a shared environment or hosted environment. They're not allowed to do things like search, right? They're not allowed to do things like have local OSTs. They're not allowed to, perform indexes and all these things. We've said these are all things you're not allowed to do because it impacts performance, right? Well, here shortly that's going to end. FSLogix is very happy to announce that here shortly we will be releasing some fireworks, some appeal, something really cool that the end user is going to like. And that is our ability to do multi-user mode search on a XenApp server. You will be able to turn search back on and not have to worry about the impact that it's going to have on the user every time they log in. So as you can see here, we've got a demo account that has mail in it. Okay, I think it has roughly 8,300 emails in it, and we have conducted a search on that. And every time I log out, what happens in the FSLogix arena is your VHD is disconnected, right? We sever that connection, but your search file is maintained in that VHD. And by maintaining that search file in the VHD, next time you log in and we mount your VHD, we're going to mount you right back to your search file. So that index for your mail is going to stay there. You will eat the hit the first time that the user has to index their mail because they haven't done it for 25 years, right? But after that, all you're going to see is the reconnection and completion of net new items on that search. So if you look here, this one says 0 items remaining, and you'll see down here that we have the FSLogix FRX Outlook, whoops, get back to the screen, FRX Outlook databases. And that is the search for Outlook that we can now roam from session to session, environment to environment, so that in your arena you can have a very non-persistent experience and allow users to have search. I'm going to pause there because I'm sure there's several questions on this, and Joe, I'll let you fire them away.
Okay, first of all, I loved your slide on the fireworks because I think this is the icing on the cake in terms of, well, I shouldn't say the icing because you all tend to keep surprising me pleasantly with what you're developing. I think this is absolutely a great feature that will enhance the user experience, especially when you're talking about an Office 365 implementation, and the user gets frustrated because things get slow. Now they can search. This is a great thing, and I know a lot of folks have had comments that come back with regard to not having the ability to search. We are actually at 1:58, so we've got 2 minutes. I know we have to close out very quickly, so let me give you another minute if there's anything else that you want to show us, and then I think we need to start winding down.
Yep, that's the end of the show and tell. For anybody that attended this webinar, if they email beta@fslogix.com, we'll put them into round 2 of the search beta. And, we'd love to hear your feedback. When we first went down this path with just single user mode, you'd have been amazed. You'd have thought we'd solved world hunger. And then people were like, when are you going to do it for multi-user mode? Well, we are very happy with that. And you're right, Joe, there are some more surprises. I can't give them all away because, our competition probably listens to this and takes notes and are trying to, come up with what that is. But we do have some more surprises that I think will, as I say, quote unquote, knock your socks off, that we will be working on for the rest of the year and going into next year. If there's any questions, please reach out to us. For the beta, please reach out to us. And then if you want to try our stuff, drop a note to sales@fslogix.com. We'd be happy to set you up with an eval. The profiles and the ODFC thing takes literally about 15 minutes. I usually spend the remainder of the hour doing training with you so that you're able to support this in your environment and know all the pieces and parts. But it is a very, very simple install and configuration. And then the Exchange piece, I encourage you, for search, if you want to participate in round 2 of that beta, reach out to us. It's beta@fslogix.com.
Okay, and I will tell you also in terms of dealing with folks at FSLogix, they're all very technical. They get to answering your questions right away, and it's not a lot of marketing stuff. It's really dig in ones and zeros and a great experience from a technical person standpoint. So I know it's the top of the hour. We do need to close out. Stephanie, I'll let you tell folks where they can go ahead and get the download from. And thanks everybody for attending.
All right, thanks you guys. Absolutely. Let me bring up my screen here. I threw in the chat window for you a link to the forum that we have for this event. I know we had a lot of questions and we didn't get them all answered, so please feel free to type in your questions in the forum, and I'm going to see if I can get Dave to answer all the ones that didn't get answered for us today. Maybe we can put those in the forum too. Dave, would you be willing to do that?
I'd be willing to do that.
Awesome. All right, and then I also just stuck in the chat window a link to our survey. It's very short, it's anonymous, and we always use that to plan future content for CUGC. Let's see, we also will have some Amazon gift card winners after today's presentation. As soon as I find those out from FSLogix, I will post those in the forum and let you guys know. And shortly after today's presentation, you'll be getting an email in the next few hours with a link to the recording if you need to go back and see anything, and a link to the survey if you don't have time to fill it out now. And with that, I wish you all a good day. I want to thank Dave and Joe and everybody for attending. And yeah, we'll be back in touch on mycugc.org. Everybody have a great day.